Hey there. Tonight we're stepping back into one of the most devastating yet forgotten chapters of the American frontier. Not the Hollywood version with heroic cowboys and dramatic showdowns, but the raw, unforgiving reality of the winter that nearly broke the spirit of the West itself. Tonight, you'll experience the big die-up of 1886 to 1887, the winter that didn't just kill cattle, it ended an era. But here's what most people don't know about this catastrophe that claimed millions of animals and shattered the dreams of an entire generation. It wasn't the cold that broke them. It wasn't even the snow. It was something far more insidious, something that crept in so gradually that by the time anyone realized the danger, escape was impossible. Before we witness this slow-motion disaster unfold, let's step into the world as it existed just months before everything changed forever. Picture the Great Plains in the spring of 1886. Imagine standing on a slight rise somewhere in Montana territory, looking out across an ocean of grass that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. This wasn't just empty land waiting to be claimed. This was the stage for the greatest boom in American agricultural history, a gold rush built not on precious metals, but on something even more valuable: beef. The cattle kingdom stretched from Texas to the Canadian border, from the Rocky Mountains nearly to the Mississippi River. Millions upon millions of longhorns, Herefords, and mixed breeds moved like living rivers across this vast grassland. It was a sight that would never be seen again. Herds so large that riders could travel for days and never reach their edges. But what you need to understand is that this wasn't just about cattle. This was about a dream so intoxicating that it drew investors from as far away as Scotland and England. Eastern newspapers breathlessly reported stories of ranchers who had started with nothing and become millionaires seemingly overnight. The mathematics seemed simple and irresistible. Buy cheap cattle in Texas, drive them north to free grass, let them multiply and fatten for a few years, then sell them for enormous profits to feed the growing cities of the East. The cowboys who worked these ranches lived lives that were both harder and more romantic than any movie could capture. Picture a typical morning in the summer of 1886. You'd wake before dawn to the sound of the cook banging on a tin plate, the signal that coffee was ready and another day of work was beginning. The air would be cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and the distant lowing of cattle. Your horse, hobbled nearby, would lift his head as you approached, ears pricked forward. The leather of your saddle would be supple from daily use, shaped to your body through countless hours in the seat. You'd swing up and ride out into a world that seemed to stretch on forever, where the only boundaries were those set by nature itself. This was the era of the open range, when cattle roamed freely across unfenced grasslands that belonged to no one and everyone. Ranchers simply turned their herds loose in the spring and gathered them again in the fall, identifying their animals by the unique brands burned into their hides. It was a system that worked because the land seemed limitless and the grass inexhaustible. The chuck wagon was the lifeline of these operations, a mobile kitchen and supply depot that followed the herds across the plains. The cook, usually a weathered veteran who ruled his domain with an iron fist, would set up camp each evening in the lee of a hill or near a water source. Cowboys would gather around the fire, sharing stories and songs that would pass into legend, though the reality was often more prosaic than the myth suggests. Their diet was monotonous but filling: beans, biscuits, salt pork, and coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. Fresh meat came from the herd itself, usually a young bull or an animal that had been injured. Vegetables were a luxury seen mainly in the larger towns. Still, there was something deeply satisfying about this simple fare, eaten under a canopy of stars so bright you could almost reach out and pluck them from the sky. The work itself was demanding beyond anything most modern people could comprehend. Cowboys spent 12 to 14 hours a day in the saddle, in weather that ranged from blazing heat to sudden, violent storms. They developed an almost telepathic connection with their horses, animals trained to work cattle with minimal guidance from their riders. A good cow pony was worth more than a month's wages, and was often the only valuable possession a cowboy owned. But beneath this seemingly idyllic surface, warning signs were accumulating like storm clouds on a distant horizon. Signs that most people either ignored or simply didn't understand the significance of. The first warning came from the grass itself. The summer of 1886 was unusually dry across much of the northern plains. Streams that normally ran year-round began to dwindle to mere trickles. The prairie grass, normally knee-deep and lush, grew thin and sparse. Experienced ranchers began to worry, but many newcomers to the business dismissed these concerns as the complaints of old-timers who were always predicting disaster. The second warning was the cattle themselves. By late summer, the herds were larger than they had ever been. Years of good profits had encouraged ranchers to expand their operations, buying more and more cattle, and turning them loose on ranges that were already approaching their carrying capacity. But here's what the investors back east didn't understand. The northern plains had always been marginal grazing land, suitable for large herds only under ideal conditions. The third warning came from the old-timers, the mountain men and early settlers who had lived through previous hard winters. They watched the behavior of wild animals, noted the thickness of beaver fur and the height at which birds built their nests. They observed that cattle were growing thicker coats earlier than usual, and that even domestic animals seemed restless and anxious. Going to be a hard winter, they'd mutter, but their warnings were lost in the optimism of the boom. And then there was the fourth warning, the one that should have terrified everyone, but instead was dismissed as an isolated incident. The previous winter, 1885 to 1886, had been unusually severe in some areas, with significant cattle losses. But the overall impact had been limited, and most ranchers attributed the deaths to poor management rather than any systemic problem. The market prices remained strong, new investment continued to pour in, and the boom rolled on. What none of them understood was that they had created a perfect trap. Millions of cattle were scattered across ranges that were already overgrazed. Unlike their ancestors who had migrated south for the winter or European cattle that were accustomed to being fed hay during cold months, these animals had been bred and trained to fend for themselves year-round. The system worked in mild winters, but no one had seriously considered what would happen if the weather turned truly severe. By October 1886, the stage was set for disaster, though almost no one recognized it. The cattle were scattered across thousands of square miles of open range, many in marginal condition after the dry summer. Ranch buildings were crude affairs, built for shelter during brief storms rather than extended sieges of cold. Hay was rarely cut and stored in significant quantities because the animals were expected to graze year-round. Feed supplies were minimal because the system was designed around natural foraging. Most critically, there was no plan for what would happen if the weather turned bad and stayed bad. The entire industry was built on the assumption that winter would be a brief interruption in an otherwise continuous cycle of grazing and growth. As November began, the first cold snaps arrived ahead of schedule. Nothing too severe at first, just a taste of what was coming. But sensitive observers noticed something ominous. The cattle were already showing signs of stress, animals that should have been gaining weight. As they prepared for winter, were instead growing thinner, their ribs becoming visible beneath their increasingly thick coats. The grass beneath the snow wasn't just sparse, it was different. Overgrazing had eliminated many of the most nutritious species, leaving behind tough, fibrous varieties that were difficult for cattle to digest. Even when the animals could paw through the snow to reach the ground, what they found provided little sustenance. And then, in late November, the sky began to change. Those who lived through it would later describe the approach of the great storm in terms that sounded almost biblical. The air grew still and heavy. The temperature began to drop, not gradually as it usually did, but in sudden, dramatic plunges that left both animals and humans reeling. What was coming would test every assumption the cattle industry had made about the Western Plains. It would reveal the difference between surviving in a harsh environment and thriving in one. It would separate those who truly understood the land from those who had simply been lucky enough to arrive during a period of unusually mild weather. But, perhaps most importantly, it would demonstrate the fundamental truth that the old-timers had tried to warn about. The plains were not conquered, merely temporarily accommodating. And when they chose to assert their power, no amount of human ambition or Eastern investment could stand against them. The wind was beginning to pick up now, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, a bitter cold that seemed to cut through clothing and flesh to reach the very bones. Those who could read the signs knew that this was no ordinary weather front approaching. This was winter, arriving not as a gradual transition, but as an invading army. The great herds continued to graze, unaware that they were about to become the victims of the largest natural disaster in the history of American ranching. The cowboys rode their rounds, checking fences and water sources, not knowing that many of them would spend the next months in a desperate struggle, simply to survive. And in ranch houses and bunkhouses across the northern plains, people went to bed on what seemed like just another cold November night, not realizing they were about to witness the end of an era. The open range was about to close forever, sealed not by barbed wire or government regulation, but by ice and snow and wind that would howl across the grasslands like the voices of all the warnings that had gone unheeded. Tomorrow, when they woke, the world would be white and silent and filled with dangers they had never imagined. The big die-up was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same again. But tonight, before we follow them into that frozen nightmare, rest in the knowledge that this is a story of more than just tragedy. It's a story of human resilience tested to its absolute limits. It's about ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when everything they had worked for was threatened with extinction. It's about the kind of strength that only emerges when survival itself is uncertain. So, let yourself drift now, back to those final peaceful moments before the storm, when the future still seemed bright, and the grass still seemed endless, and the dream of the cattle kingdom still filled the imagination of a growing nation. Because sometimes, to understand how strong we can be, we first need to understand how fragile we really are. The morning of November 16th, 1886, dawned with an eerie stillness that veteran plainsmen recognized immediately. Not the peaceful quiet of a calm day, but the unnatural silence that comes when every living thing instinctively hunkers down, sensing something terrible approaching. You would have felt it first in the air itself, a metallic taste on your tongue, a pressure in your ears that made sounds seem muffled and distant. The cattle felt it too. Instead of their usual restless movement across the range, they stood motionless, heads raised, nostrils flaring as they tested the wind for scents their ancestors would have recognized as warnings. But here's what makes this storm different from every weather disaster you've ever heard about. It didn't announce itself with thunderclaps or visible walls of clouds racing across the horizon. This destroyer came as a whisper, before it became a scream, and by the time people understood what was happening, escape was already impossible. The temperature began its descent gradually, almost gently. 40 degrees at dawn. 35 by mid-morning. Cowboys riding the range pulled their coats tighter but didn't think much of it. November was supposed to be cold after all. But experienced hands noticed something troubling. The drop wasn't stopping. 28 degrees by noon, 20 by mid-afternoon, and still falling. Then came the wind. At first it was just a breeze, barely enough to stir the dry grass. But within an hour, that whisper had become a moan, and the moan had become something that sounded almost alive. A constant, growing howl that seemed to come from every direction at once. Cowboys trying to check on distant herds found themselves leaning into gusts that pushed back with the force of invisible hands. By evening, the temperature had plummeted to 10 degrees below zero, and the wind was screaming across the plains at 60 miles per hour. But here's the detail that still haunts the survivors' accounts. The snow, when it finally came, didn't fall so much as it flew sideways, driven by winds so fierce that individual flakes became tiny projectiles that stung exposed skin like needles. Picture yourself as a cowboy, caught 5 miles from the ranch house when this hell unleashed itself. One moment you're checking on a group of steers in a sheltered valley. The next, you're engulfed in a white blindness, so complete you can't see your horse's ears. The cold doesn't gradually seep into your bones. It attacks like a living thing, finding every gap in your clothing, every exposed inch of skin. Your horse, spooked by the wind and the stinging snow, begins to panic. These animals, bred for steadiness under pressure, start to lose their minds in conditions their instincts tell them are lethal. You try to guide him toward where you think the ranch might be, but the landscape has disappeared. Every familiar landmark is erased. The world has become a howling white void where up and down lose their meaning. This is when you realize the most terrifying truth about a true blizzard. It's not just weather. It's disorientation made manifest. Men who had ridden these ranges for decades became lost within sight of their own front doors. The wind doesn't just bring cold, it brings a kind of madness, a confusion so complete that experienced plainsmen found themselves riding in circles, passing the same fence post 3 times without recognizing it. But what happened to the cattle in those first hours reveals something even more horrifying about the nature of this disaster. Unlike horses, which would seek shelter instinctively, the open-range cattle had been bred and trained to graze continuously. When the wind began to push them, they followed their instincts and moved with it, not understanding that this time, the wind had no intention of stopping. Imagine millions of animals, each weighing over 1,000 pounds, beginning a slow, confused migration to nowhere. They couldn't see where they were going. They couldn't turn back, because the animals behind them kept pushing forward. And they couldn't stop, because stopping meant facing directly into wind and snow that felt like standing in front of a frozen waterfall. The sound they made wasn't the familiar lowing of cattle on a normal day. Survivors described it as something between a moan and a scream, the collective voice of animals who sensed they were walking toward their own destruction but couldn't understand how to escape it. That sound, carried on the wind across hundreds of miles, became the soundtrack of the catastrophe, a bass note of despair that seemed to rise from the earth itself. By midnight on that first night, the temperature had reached 30 below zero. The wind was gusting to 80 miles per hour, and the snow was falling so heavily that even veteran weather watchers had never seen anything like it. But here's what makes this storm particularly cruel. It didn't exhaust itself in a single night of fury and then move on. It settled over the northern plains like a siege, maintaining its intensity, not for hours, but for days. When cowboys managed to struggle back to ranch houses, they brought reports that sounded like dispatches from a war zone, herds of thousands of cattle simply vanishing into the white. Familiar creeks and valleys completely transformed into alien landscapes of drifted snow. And everywhere, the constant, maddening howl of wind that seemed to mock every human attempt to impose order on the chaos. The ranch buildings themselves, designed for the typical brief storms of the region, began to fail almost immediately. Roofs that had seemed solid groaned under the weight of snow that accumulated faster than anyone had thought possible. Windows rattled in their frames like teeth chattering from cold. And the thin walls, adequate for normal winter weather, proved pathetically inadequate against wind that found every crack and gap, turning living spaces into barely warmer versions of the hell outside. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of this storm was its persistence. Western storms were supposed to blow through quickly, exhausting themselves in dramatic but brief displays of power. This one settled in like an occupying army, maintaining its assault day after day, night after night, until people began to wonder if winter had come to stay forever. By the third day, when the wind finally began to calm and the snow reduced from a horizontal assault to merely heavy flakes, the transformed landscape that emerged looked like an alien planet. Snow had drifted against every obstacle, buildings, fences, even standing cattle, creating strange, sculptural formations that reached heights no one had imagined possible. And in this transformed world, the real horror was just beginning to reveal itself. Because this wasn't the end of the storm. It was just the end of the first storm. What no one understood yet was that this winter would bring not one catastrophic blizzard, but a series of them, each one finding the survivors weaker and less prepared than before. The cattle that had survived the first assault were now scattered across hundreds of miles of unfamiliar territory, separated from their home ranges, weakened by days without food or water, and facing the grim mathematics of survival in conditions their bodies were never designed to endure. The cowboys who would try to save them were about to discover that heroism in a blizzard looks nothing like the movies. There would be no dramatic rescues or triumphant victories. Instead, there would be a grinding, desperate struggle against forces so vast and impersonal that human will seemed meaningless against them. The silence that followed the first storm was almost more unnerving than the wind had been. It was the quiet of a world holding its breath, waiting to see what would emerge from beneath the snow when the sun finally managed to break through the gray ceiling of clouds that still pressed down like a stone lid on the frozen earth. But even as that pale sun began to reveal the scope of the disaster, those who understood the rhythms of plains weather were looking nervously at the northwest horizon, because the old-timers could read the signs in the sky, and what they saw there was not relief, but preparation for the next assault. The big die-up had begun, but this was only the first movement in a symphony of survival that would test every human and animal on the northern plains. The question was no longer whether they could maintain their way of life. It was whether they could maintain life itself. 4 o'clock in the morning, and the world is still locked in that absolute darkness that only exists in deep winter, when the sun seems to have abandoned the earth entirely. But you can't sleep anymore because your body has become a clock wound too tight, every muscle cramped from cold that has seeped so deep into your bones that warmth feels like a half-remembered dream from childhood. Your breath comes out in clouds so thick they immediately freeze and fall to the floor of the bunkhouse with tiny crystalline sounds like breaking glass. The stove, carefully banked the night before, has gone cold, despite your best efforts. The metal chimney pipe running through the ceiling is covered in a layer of frost, so thick it looks like fur, and when you touch it, the ice burns your fingers through your gloves. This is how every day begins now for the cowboys trying to save what's left of the herds. Not with the romantic image of men eager to ride out into adventure, but with the grim ritual of preparing to enter a world that seems designed to kill anything foolish enough to venture into it. Getting dressed becomes an ordeal that would challenge an Arctic explorer. Your clothes, hung near the stove the night before, are frozen stiff as boards. Your boots have become blocks of ice that you must warm over the embers before you can even consider putting them on your feet. The leather is so cold it burns through your socks, but you pull them on anyway because the alternative is staying inside while cattle die, and that's not an option for any cowboy worth his wages. But here's the detail that reveals just how desperate these conditions have become. You're no longer dressing to be comfortable or even warm. You're dressing like a man preparing to enter a battle where the enemy is the very air around you. Every layer matters. Every gap in your clothing could mean the difference between making it home that night or becoming another casualty of the winter. First, your union suit, long underwear that, if you're lucky, your wife or the cook's wife knitted with wool thick enough to turn a knife. Over that, a flannel shirt, then a wool vest, then another shirt if you have one. Your pants are heavy canvas or denim, so thick and stiff they stand up by themselves. Over those, if you can manage it, a pair of leather chaps that will provide some protection from the wind. Your coat is a buffalo hide or bearskin affair that weighs 30 pounds and hangs to your knees. It's not tailored for elegance. It's constructed like armor against cold that can kill. The collar turns up to protect your neck, and if you're wise, you've rigged a piece of cloth or fur to cover your nose and mouth, because breathing air this cold unfiltered will freeze the moisture in your lungs. But getting dressed is only the first challenge. Now you have to venture outside to the barn. And this short walk, maybe 50 yards that you could cover in 30 seconds during summer becomes a journey that requires the same careful planning as crossing a desert. The wind hits you like a physical blow. Not the steady wind you might expect, but gusts that come from changing directions, as if the storm is deliberately trying to confuse and disorient you. The snow isn't the gentle, picturesque fall of Christmas cards. It's a horizontal assault that stings exposed skin and immediately begins working its way into every opening in your clothing. Your eyes begin to water from the cold, and those tears freeze before they can fall, creating ice crystals on your eyelashes that make it even harder to see. The wind creates a noise so constant and overwhelming that it becomes a kind of deafness. You can't hear your own footsteps, can't hear if someone is calling for help, can't even hear your own thoughts clearly. Walking through snow that might be knee-deep in some places and over your head in others requires a kind of swimming motion, pushing through drifts that seem designed to trap and exhaust you. Your legs burn with the effort, and you quickly discover that the simple act of moving forward requires 3 times the energy it would under normal conditions. But the real challenge begins when you reach the barn and discover what the night has done to your horses. These animals, bred for toughness and endurance, are suffering in ways that break your heart to witness. Their water has frozen solid, despite your efforts to insulate the troughs. Their feed is gone, not eaten, but scattered by wind that somehow found its way through every gap in the barn walls. Some of the horses are shivering so violently their whole bodies shake. And when you approach them, you can see the fear in their eyes. This is when you confront the terrible mathematics of survival. Your horse needs food and water to maintain the strength necessary to carry you through the day's work. But providing that food and water requires energy and resources that are becoming more precious with every passing hour. Every bale of hay you feed to the horses is a bale that won't be available for the cattle. Every bit of grain you give them is grain that might mean the difference between life and death for other animals later. Saddling a horse in these conditions becomes a test of both your skill and your stamina. The leather is frozen solid and must be warmed and worked before it becomes pliable enough to use. The metal bits and buckles are so cold they stick to your skin if you touch them with bare hands. Your fingers, despite heavy gloves, quickly become numb to the point where you can't feel what you're doing, working entirely by muscle memory and hope. But here's what makes this morning ritual particularly cruel. You know, as you struggle to prepare your horse for another day of searching for cattle, that the animals you're trying to save are getting weaker and more desperate with every hour that passes. While you're spending an hour just getting ready to leave the barn, hundreds of cattle are standing somewhere in the open, burning their body fat to stay alive, using up the energy they'll need to survive the next night. The horse you finally manage to saddle is not the eager, spirited animal of summer roundups. This is a creature pushed to the edge of its own endurance, conserving every movement, every breath. When you swing into the saddle, you feel the reluctance in every muscle of the horse's body. This animal understands, perhaps better than you do, that what you're about to ask of it might be more than it can give. Riding out into the storm requires navigating by instinct and luck rather than sight. The familiar landmarks of summer, rock outcroppings, distinctive trees, the natural contours of the land have all been erased by snow and transformed into alien shapes. What used to be a gentle hill might now be a wall of drifted snow 15 feet high. What used to be a creek bed might now be a trap waiting to swallow horse and rider. Your horse struggles through snow that sometimes reaches its chest, plunging and fighting for footing on ground made treacherous by hidden ice. Each step is a gamble, solid ground or a hidden hole that could break a leg, firm footing or slick ice disguised by a thin layer of snow. The cold attacks your body in waves. First, your extremities, fingers and toes that begin to ache, then burn, then gradually lose all feeling. Then your face, where any exposed skin quickly becomes numb and then begins to freeze. The moisture from your breath freezes in your mustache and beard, creating a mask of ice that makes eating and drinking nearly impossible. But the psychological toll is perhaps worse than the physical suffering. Riding for hours through a landscape that offers no variety, no landmarks, no sense of progress or direction, creates a kind of madness. The white expanse plays tricks on your eyes, making you see cattle where there are only snow-covered bushes, making you believe you're moving forward when you might actually be traveling in circles. And always, underneath the immediate challenges of navigation and survival, is the growing certainty that the cattle you're searching for are dying while you struggle just to reach them. Every hour you spend fighting through the snow is an hour during which the animals you're trying to save are burning through their remaining strength, getting closer to the point where rescue becomes impossible. This is the daily reality that Hollywood westerns never captured. Heroism in the real West often looked like a man barely staying alive himself while trying to save animals that might already be beyond saving. It looked like making the same desperate journey day after day, knowing that each trip out into the storm brought diminishing returns and increased the chance that you might not make it back. The romance of the cowboy life had been stripped away completely, leaving only the most basic and brutal equation: endurance against impossible odds, with death as the penalty for any mistake, any moment of weakness, any failure of will. By noon, if you could even tell it was noon in the gray twilight that passes for daylight during a winter storm, your horse would be exhausted and you would face the terrible decision that defined this entire catastrophe. Do you push harder, risking both your lives for the chance of finding cattle that might still be saved? Or do you turn back, knowing that animals are dying while you retreat to safety? Most days, the answer was to push harder, because that's what cowboys did. Even when pushing harder meant riding into conditions that would challenge the survival skills of Arctic explorers, even when it meant accepting risks that no reasonable person would take, even when it meant choosing the possibility of saving a few cattle over the certainty of your own survival. This was the price of the code they lived by, and this winter was testing that code to its absolute limit. When you finally find them, the cattle present a sight that will haunt your dreams for the rest of your life. If you survive this winter to have dreams at all, they're huddled together in whatever shelter they could find: the lee side of a hill, a grove of bare cottonwoods, sometimes just pressed against each other in the open, forming living walls against the wind. But these aren't the robust, healthy animals you remember from summer roundups. These are walking skeletons wrapped in hide, their ribs visible through their winter coats, their eyes holding a look of desperate confusion that speaks to something fundamentally broken in their world. The strongest ones are on the outside of the group, using their bodies to shield the weaker animals in the center. But even the strong ones are trembling with a bone-deep cold that no amount of thick hide can protect against. When they see you approaching, some lift their heads with what might be hope, or it might just be the last flicker of an instinct that once told them humans meant safety and food. But here's the crushing reality that every cowboy confronted during the big die-up. Finding the cattle was only the beginning of an impossible task, because now you had to figure out how to keep them alive when the very elements that sustained life had been transformed into instruments of death. Water, the most basic requirement for survival, had become the cruelest challenge. Every stream, every pond, every water source that had sustained these herds through previous winters was now locked under ice so thick that breaking through it required tools most cowboys didn't carry, and strength that was already being depleted by the simple act of staying alive. Picture yourself standing beside what used to be a gently flowing creek, now transformed into a solid ribbon of ice stretching as far as you can see in either direction. The cattle gather around it instinctively, their tongues working desperately to lick at snow and ice that provides almost no moisture and actually costs them energy to consume, energy they can't afford to lose. You dismount and begin the backbreaking work of trying to open a water source. Your axe, if you remembered to bring one, is so cold the metal burns through your gloves. Each swing sends vibrations through your arms that feel like electric shocks in the frigid air. The ice doesn't chip away cleanly. It fractures in unpredictable patterns, and often an hour of chopping produces only a small hole that begins to freeze over again almost immediately. But even when you succeed in breaking through to flowing water beneath, yet you face the heartbreaking spectacle of cattle so weak they can barely push forward to drink. The stronger animals surge ahead, and the weaker ones, desperately thirsty but lacking the strength to fight for position, are pushed aside. You watch animals that have traveled hundreds of miles together, that have grazed side by side through countless peaceful summers, now competing with each other for resources so scarce that sharing means dying. Some cattle, driven beyond reason by thirst, try to break through the ice themselves, using their hooves and the weight of their bodies. What happens next is a scene from a nightmare. Animals breaking through into water so cold it shocks their systems, then finding themselves trapped as the ice reforms around them. Unable to climb out, lacking the strength to break free, they die slowly in full view of the herd, and of you, the cowboy, whose job it is to save them. The sound they make as this happens isn't the normal lowing of cattle. It's something between a scream and a moan, a sound that speaks to suffering so profound that it reaches across species lines and touches something primal in your own understanding of mortality. And there's nothing you can do but watch, because any attempt to rescue an animal trapped in ice would likely result in your own death, and then there would be no one left to help the others. This is when you understand the mathematics of triage in its most brutal form. You can't save them all. You probably can't save most of them. The question becomes, which ones have enough strength left that your efforts might actually matter? Feeding the cattle presents challenges that are equally heartbreaking, but in different ways. In a normal winter, cattle would paw through moderate snow to reach the grass beneath. Their hooves and muzzles were perfectly designed for this work, evolved over thousands of years to find sustenance even when it was buried. But the snow of the big die-up wasn't moderate. It was often 4 feet deep, sometimes deeper, and it had a hard crust formed by repeated melting and freezing that cut the cattle's legs when they tried to dig through it. Watching a half-starved animal use its last reserves of strength to dig for grass that might not even be there, bleeding from cuts on its legs as it paws frantically through snow that seems to mock its efforts, breaks something in your heart that you didn't even know could be broken. These are creatures designed by nature to be self-sufficient, reduced to a desperation that strips away every dignity evolution had given them. For those ranchers who had the foresight to cut some hay before the winter, and there weren't many, distributing it became a logistical nightmare that tested both human ingenuity and human endurance. Hay stored in barns had to be loaded onto wagons or sleds that could barely move through the deep snow. The work required to get a single load of feed to a herd might take an entire day and exhaust both men and horses. But here's what made this effort particularly heartbreaking. You would struggle for hours to deliver a few 100 pounds of hay to a herd of several thousand animals. You would watch the cattle surge toward the feed with a desperation that revealed just how close they were to starvation. And then you would have to watch as the hay disappeared in minutes, providing perhaps a single day's worth of sustenance to animals that needed weeks of feeding to recover their strength. Some cowboys tried cutting down cottonwood trees so the cattle could eat the bark. The work was exhausting, felling trees with frozen axes, dragging the branches through snow that was sometimes chest-deep on a horse, then watching as hungry animals stripped every piece of bark and then tried to eat the wood itself, their stomachs so empty that anything remotely organic seemed like food. The sight of cattle eating tree bark with the same desperate intensity they had once reserved for the finest prairie grass was perhaps the most visible symbol of how completely the natural order had been disrupted. These were grazing animals designed to process grass and soft plants, now reduced to chewing wood and thorns and anything else that might provide even the smallest amount of nutrition. Families with small herds sometimes tried grinding frozen corn or wheat and carrying it to their animals in buckets. This meant breaking ice off the grain, working with mittened hands to operate hand-cranked mills, then trudging through snow carrying heavy buckets that would freeze solid if not distributed quickly enough. The work was so labor-intensive that feeding 100 head of cattle this way would occupy an entire family from dawn to dusk. And the amount of grain they could provide was never enough to do more than postpone starvation. But perhaps the most soul-crushing aspect of trying to feed cattle during the big die-up was the realization that came to every cowboy sooner or later. You were forced to choose, not just which animals to feed first, but which animals to feed at all. Your resources, hay, grain, tree bark, whatever you could find, were so limited that using them for animals that were probably going to die anyway meant condemning other animals that might still have a chance. This wasn't a decision any cowboy had ever expected to make. The code of the range included caring for your animals as well as you cared for yourself, sometimes better, but this winter stripped away the luxury of that kind of universal compassion. You learned to look at a herd and identify the animals that still had some spark of vitality in their eyes, some remaining flesh on their bones, some chance of survival if you invested your limited resources in them. And you learned to walk away from the others, to ignore their pleading looks, to turn your back on their obvious suffering, because the mathematical reality was that every bit of energy you spent on animals that were going to die regardless was energy you couldn't spend on animals that might still be saved. This was perhaps the cruelest lesson the big die-up taught, that survival sometimes requires a hardness of heart that goes against every natural instinct of compassion. Cowboys who had spent their lives thinking of themselves as protectors of their herds were forced to become judges, deciding which animals deserved the chance to live and which would be abandoned to die. The psychological toll of these decisions was immense. Men who had never questioned their own moral compass found themselves making choices that would have seemed unthinkable just months earlier. And they had to make these choices not once, but every day, sometimes multiple times a day, as conditions continued to worsen and resources became even more scarce. By the end of January 1887, most cowboys had learned to recognize the look of an animal that had passed the point of no return, the glassy stare of eyes that no longer focused properly, the way breathing became labored even when the animal was standing still, the stumbling gait that meant the creature's body was beginning to consume its own muscle tissue to stay alive. Learning to read these signs was a necessary survival skill, but it was also a kind of knowledge that changed the men who acquired it. They became able to look at suffering with a clinical detachment that protected their ability to function, but cost them something indefinable in their relationship with the natural world they had once felt at home in. The winter was teaching them that nature wasn't the benevolent provider of grass and water they had imagined, but an indifferent force that could withdraw its gifts as suddenly and completely as it had provided them. And survival in such a world required not just physical endurance, but a hardness of spirit that few men possessed naturally, and even fewer wanted to acquire. But they acquired it anyway, because the alternative was watching everything die while retaining the luxury of tender feelings that helped no one and saved nothing. While the cowboys waged their desperate battle against the storm, a different kind of survival story unfolds in the ranch houses, homestead cabins, and sod houses scattered across the frozen plains. Here, families face their own version of the same impossible mathematics. How to stay alive when every system that once sustained life has been pushed beyond its breaking point. Picture a typical homestead cabin, not the cozy, warm refuge of frontier mythology, but the harsh reality of a structure built quickly and cheaply, designed to keep out summer heat and moderate winter cold, now asked to protect human life against temperatures that would challenge an Arctic research station. The cabin is small, maybe 16 by 20 feet for an entire family. The walls are thin boards with gaps that were barely noticeable in moderate weather, but now whistle with wind that carries snow into the living space like frozen sand. The single window, if there is one, has been covered with whatever fabric the family could spare. Blankets, canvas, even newspapers, because any glass becomes a conductor for cold that can drop the interior temperature by 20 degrees. But here's what makes these homes particularly vulnerable. They were designed around the assumption that fuel for heating would be abundant and accessible. Homesteaders had counted on gathering buffalo chips from the prairie, cutting wood from creek bottoms, or buying coal that could be hauled from distant railheads. The winter has made all of these fuel sources either inaccessible or prohibitively expensive for families whose resources are already stretched to the breaking point. Sarah McKinnon, a widow with 3 children trying to hold onto a homestead 20 miles north of what would someday be Billings, faces the same terrible choice every morning. Burn more fuel to keep the family warm, or conserve what's left and risk having nothing when the next storm arrives. Her fuel pile, which seemed adequate when winter began, is shrinking with frightening speed. She's already burned the spare furniture, the extra chair her late husband built, the small table that served no essential purpose, even some of the floorboards from the unused back room. Each piece that goes into the stove represents not just warmth for a few hours, but the permanent destruction of everything her family has built. But the cold is relentless, seeping through every crack, every gap, every imperfection in the cabin's construction. On the coldest nights, the temperature inside drops so low that water left in a bucket freezes solid within hours. The family's breath creates clouds of vapor that immediately condense and freeze on the windows, walls, and even the blankets they sleep under. Sleeping becomes an ordeal that requires the same kind of strategic planning once reserved for military campaigns. The entire family crowds into the single room closest to the stove, piling every blanket, coat, and piece of spare clothing into a communal nest. The children sleep in the middle, with the adults on the outside, using their bodies as shields against the cold that seeps in through the walls. But even this arrangement can't prevent the extremities, fingers, toes, noses, from becoming so cold they ache constantly. Frostbite becomes a daily threat even inside the house. Children learn to sleep with their hands inside their clothing, pressed against their bodies for warmth. Everyone sleeps fully clothed, including boots, because the morning routine of getting dressed in a freezing room could itself be dangerous. The windows, what few exist, become strange crystalline artworks as moisture from breathing and cooking freezes in elaborate patterns on the glass. These ice formations are beautiful, but they also represent a fundamental failure of the house to protect its inhabitants. Each crystal is evidence that the warm air inside is meeting the deadly cold outside with nothing substantial to separate them. Cooking becomes a careful balance between preparing food the family needs to maintain their strength and conserving fuel that's required to keep them alive. Meals that once took an hour to prepare are now rushed through in minutes to minimize the time the stove door is open and heat is escaping. Bread, if there's flour to make it, is baked quickly and then wrapped in whatever insulation is available to retain its warmth as long as possible. Water presents its own challenges. The well, if there is one, may be frozen, solid, or accessible only by breaking through ice that reforms as quickly as it can be cleared. Families learn to melt snow for drinking water, but this requires precious fuel and produces liquid that tastes flat and unsatisfying. Some families resort to heating rocks in the fire and then using them to melt snow in containers, conserving wood while still producing the water necessary for survival. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of homestead survival is the isolation. Families that might have visited neighbors regularly during milder weather are now cut off completely from outside contact. The nearest neighbors might be only a few miles away, but those miles have become as impassable as an ocean. No one travels unless absolutely necessary, and absolutely necessary usually means someone is dying. This isolation creates a pressure cooker of family dynamics. People accustomed to having space, to being able to step outside or visit neighbors when tensions arise, are now trapped together in a single room for weeks at a time. Children who can't play outside become restless and fractious. Adults struggling with their own fears and exhaustion have no outlet for stress except each other. Mary Henderson, snowed in with her husband and 4 children in a sod house near what is now North Dakota, writes in her diary about the strange claustrophobia of being trapped with the people you love most in the world. The children grow more irritable each day, she notes. and I find myself snapping at them for the smallest infractions. We are all tired of hearing each other breathe, tired of the same faces, the same conversations, the same fears, spoken and unspoken. But families also discover reserves of creativity and cooperation that surprise them. Children who had been reluctant to help with chores become essential partners in the survival effort, learning to tend fires, melt snow for water, and prepare simple meals. Adults who had maintained traditional gender roles find themselves sharing tasks based on necessity rather than convention. Whoever has the strength and skill for a job does it, regardless of whether it's traditionally men's or women's work. Storytelling becomes a survival tool almost as important as fuel or food. Families spend the long, dark evenings recounting every story they can remember. Fairy tales, Bible stories, family histories, adventures from books read long ago. These narratives serve multiple purposes. They pass time. They keep minds occupied with something other than fear and cold. And they create a shared mental space that's warmer and safer than the physical reality surrounding them. Some families discover that singing helps maintain morale and provides a kind of psychological fuel that's as necessary as wood or coal. Hymns, folk songs, lullabies, any music that can be produced without instruments becomes a weapon against despair. The human voice, even weakened by cold and poor nutrition, represents life asserting itself against conditions that seem designed to extinguish it. But even music can't entirely mask the sounds that haunt these isolated homes. The constant groaning and cracking of wood contracting in the cold, the whistle and moan of wind finding new paths through the structure, and most unsettling of all, the occasional distant sound that might be cattle lowing or might be something else entirely, wolves perhaps, or other families calling for help that no one can provide. Sleep, when it comes, is fitful and full of dreams that blend the day's struggles with deeper fears about what might happen if the cold continues, if the fuel runs out, if the food doesn't last, if help doesn't come. Children wake crying from nightmares about freezing, and adults lie awake calculating and recalculating how long their supplies might last under different scenarios, none of them particularly encouraging. The daily routine becomes a ritual of survival maintenance. Bank the fire carefully to last through the night, but not so carefully that it dies and requires precious matches to restart. Distribute the available blankets to maximize warmth while ensuring no one is left completely uncovered. Check for new gaps in the walls or roof that might be letting in cold air. Inventory the remaining food and fuel, making difficult decisions about rationing. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of homestead survival is maintaining hope in the face of circumstances that seem hopeless. Families know they're burning through their resources faster than anyone had planned. They know the weather shows no signs of moderating. They know that if someone becomes seriously ill or injured, there's no way to get help. And they know that other families are facing the same desperate circumstances. So even if help were possible, there might not be anyone in a position to provide it. Yet somehow, most families find ways to maintain the routines and relationships that define their identity as more than just organisms trying to stay alive. Children still receive lessons when possible, even if it's just practicing arithmetic with beans or learning letters traced in the frost on windows. Adults still try to maintain the courtesies and kindnesses that distinguish human society from mere survival. This determination to remain civilized people rather than just survivors becomes its own form of resistance against the winter. By maintaining standards of behavior, by continuing to care for each other's emotional needs as well as physical ones, by refusing to let desperation turn them into something they wouldn't recognize, these families fight a battle that's as important as the fight against cold and hunger. But they also learn hard lessons about the limits of civilization when it comes up against the raw power of nature. They learn that survival sometimes requires abandoning the luxury of perfect honesty, of complete fairness, of infinite patience. They learn that even good people can become selfish when resources are scarce enough. They learn that love, while essential, isn't always enough to overcome the basic mathematics of survival. As February arrives with no sign of relief, many families have been pushed to the very edge of their resources. The conversation around their inadequate fires increasingly turns to questions no one wants to ask. What happens when the food runs out? What happens when there's no more fuel? What happens if someone gets sick? What happens if the cold never ends? These are the questions that keep parents awake at night, staring at the ceiling and listening to their children's breathing, wondering if they'll have the strength and wisdom to protect the lives that depend on them when the winter demands more than they have left to give. By mid-January 1887, something fundamental had shifted in the people struggling to survive the endless winter. It wasn't just that they were tired or hungry or cold, though they were all of these things to degrees that pushed the human body to its limits. It was something deeper, something that showed in their eyes when they looked at each other across the inadequate warmth of their fires. The change was visible first in the hands. Cowboys, who had spent their lives working with rope and leather, now bore the permanent marks of frostbite. Fingertips blackened and numb, fingers that could no longer grip a rope properly, hands that trembled not just from the cold but from nerve damage that would never fully heal. Some lost fingers entirely to the cold, discovering them one morning as hard and gray as pieces of wood, already dead though still attached to their bodies. But the cruel irony was that losing fingers made every other aspect of survival more difficult. Tying knots, handling tools, even the simple act of buttoning clothing became monumental challenges for men whose livelihood had always depended on the precise coordination of hand and eye. Cowboys who could once rope a running steer at full gallop now struggled to light a match or hold a coffee cup steady. The women faced their own catalog of physical deterioration. Hauling water, chopping wood, and maintaining fires in impossible conditions left them with backs that ached constantly and shoulders that couldn't lift their arms above their heads. Their hands, like the men's, bore the scars of frostbite, but they also showed the cuts and burns that came from working around fires and hot stoves while wearing bulky gloves that made every task clumsy and dangerous. Children suffered in ways that were perhaps the most heartbreaking to witness. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster and had fewer reserves to draw upon when food became scarce. Some developed a persistent cough from breathing air so cold it damaged their lungs. Others showed the telltale signs of malnutrition, hair that lost its shine, skin that took on a grayish pallor, a listlessness that replaced the natural energy of childhood. But it was the psychological toll that proved most devastating of all. Something was breaking inside the people of the northern plains, something that might never heal completely, even if they survived the winter. The isolation had become more than just loneliness. Cut off from neighbors, from news, from any sense of connection to the wider world, families began to lose track not just of days and dates, but of their place in a larger human community. The world had contracted to the dimensions of their immediate shelter, and beyond that, nothing existed except the howling wilderness that seemed determined to erase them entirely. Thomas Morrison, a rancher whose spread covered 20,000 acres in what is now eastern Montana, writes in his journal about the strange transformation in his own thinking. "I find myself forgetting there are other people in the world," he notes. When I look out at the snow, I cannot imagine that somewhere the sun is shining, that somewhere people are warm and comfortable. It seems impossible that this winter will ever end, that spring will ever come. I begin to understand how a man might lose his mind in such conditions. The lack of reliable food was gnawing away at both physical and mental resilience. Families were surviving on rations that would have been considered starvation level in normal times, perhaps one meal a day, consisting mainly of beans or cornmeal stretched as far as possible, sometimes flavored with small pieces of salt pork that had to be doled out like medicine. But hunger does more than just weaken the body. It changes the way people think, making them irritable, suspicious, prone to dark thoughts they would never have entertained when well fed. Arguments broke out over trivial matters. Who got the last biscuit? Who was working harder to maintain the fire? Who was using more than their share of the blankets? These weren't character flaws asserting themselves. They were the predictable results of brains deprived of the glucose they needed to function normally. Sleep became elusive, not just because of the cold, but because of the constant, low-level anxiety of people who knew they were living on borrowed time. How many more weeks could they survive on their remaining supplies? What would they do when the last of the flour was gone? What would happen if someone became seriously ill when the nearest doctor was 50 miles away across impassable terrain? Some families found their relationships strengthened by the shared ordeal. Parents who had been distant with their children found themselves talking for hours about everything and nothing, desperate for human connection in the face of an environment that seemed actively hostile to human existence. Husbands and wives who had grown apart during the busy seasons of ranching discovered new depths of partnership as they fought together against circumstances that threatened everything they had built. But other families discovered fault lines they had never known existed. The stress of constant survival decisions revealed incompatibilities and resentments that had been buried under the routines of normal life. Some marriages didn't survive the winter, even when the people involved did. Perhaps most disturbing of all was what happened to the children. Kids who had been raised with the optimism and energy natural to youth began to exhibit behaviors that belonged to much older people. They became cautious, conservative, reluctant to take any risks or waste any resources. They learned to hoard food, to eye the fire anxiously, to wake at any unusual sound that might signal new danger. But the most haunting transformation was the way children began to talk about the future, or rather the way they stopped talking about it entirely. The plans and dreams that had once filled their conversations disappeared, replaced by a grim focus on getting through each day. When asked what they wanted to be when they grew up, many simply answered, alive. Letters from this period, when they exist at all, reveal the psychological landscape of people pushed beyond their normal limits. Martha Stevens, writing to her sister in Ohio, captures the disorientation that many felt. I try to remember what it was like before the snow came, but those memories seem like stories someone told me about strangers. Did we really used to worry about things like what dress to wear, or whether the garden looked neat? Those concerns seemed to belong to a different species of human being. The uncertainty was perhaps the worst part. If the families had known the winter would last exactly 4 months, they could have planned accordingly. But not knowing whether relief would come in days, weeks, or months made every decision an agonizing gamble. Use the last of the coal tonight to stay warm, or save it for tomorrow night when it might be even colder. Feed the children a full meal today, or stretch the food over several days of smaller portions. Some people found unexpected sources of strength in religious faith, spending hours in prayer and finding comfort in the belief that their suffering had meaning beyond mere endurance. Others lost their faith entirely, unable to reconcile their belief in a benevolent universe with the seemingly random cruelty of their circumstances. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery was how much human beings could endure when endurance was the only alternative to death. People found they could function on one meal every other day. They found they could work effectively with hands so numb they couldn't feel what they were touching. They found they could make rational decisions even when every instinct screamed at them to panic. What they also discovered was that survival required them to become different versions of themselves, more calculating, less trusting, quicker to recognize threats, and slower to extend help to others who might drain their own precious resources. The winter was teaching them that the moral luxuries they had taken for granted, generosity, optimism, the assumption that there would always be enough for everyone, were exactly that, luxuries that could be afforded only when survival was secure. Dr. William Reynolds, one of the few medical professionals in the region, made rounds when impossible to isolated homesteads, and later wrote about the psychological changes he observed. The people I treated this winter were not the same individuals I had known before the storms began, he noted. They had become harder, more suspicious, less willing to trust in anything beyond their own immediate experience. They had learned to live day by day, hour by hour, in a way that spoke to both remarkable adaptability and profound trauma. By February, some families had reached the point where they were burning books for fuel, feeding precious family Bibles and cherished novels to fires that provided warmth for only a few hours. The symbolism wasn't lost on them. They were literally consuming their own culture, their own history, their own dreams of something beyond mere survival. But even in these extremes, most families found ways to maintain some thread of connection to their former selves. A mother might save a single photograph from the flames. A father might continue to read aloud from a book even as he prepared to burn it the next day. Children might play quiet games with buttons or scraps of cloth, maintaining the rituals of childhood even in circumstances that demanded adult endurance. The question that haunted everyone was not just whether they would survive the winter, but whether they would recognize themselves when it was over. The people who had started this winter as optimistic pioneers and confident ranchers were being transformed by circumstances into something harder, more desperate, more fundamentally changed than anyone had imagined possible. And yet, they endured. Day after impossible day, they found ways to continue, to protect each other, to maintain hope, even when hope seemed irrational. The human toll of the big die-up wasn't just measured in frostbite and malnutrition, but in the deeper question of what it cost people to discover just how much they could survive. Because sometimes the price of survival is becoming someone you never thought you could be. Desperation, they say, is the mother of invention. But what the big die-up taught the people of the northern plains was that desperation could also be the mother of miracles. Small, fragile miracles that sometimes worked and sometimes failed spectacularly, but represented the only hope in a world where conventional wisdom had proven fatally inadequate. By early February, every traditional method of winter survival had been exhausted or proven impossible. The time for normal solutions was over. Now began the era of impossible schemes, desperate gambles, and innovations born from the terrible creativity that emerges when death becomes a daily neighbor. Jake Morrison, whose ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of what is now southern Alberta, hit upon an idea that would have seemed insane in normal circumstances but made perfect sense in the context of the big die-up. He began herding his remaining cattle, perhaps 300 head out of an original herd of 2,000, into a sheltered valley where cottonwood trees provided some natural windbreak. The work required to move cattle through snow that was often deeper than the animals were tall defied every principle of efficient ranching. It took 6 men an entire day to move what they could have driven in an hour during normal conditions. The cattle, weakened by months of poor nutrition and constant cold, could barely walk, much less be driven in any organized fashion. But Morrison's real innovation came when he reached the valley. Instead of simply hoping the natural shelter would be enough, he began building what can only be described as a fortress for cattle. Using his chuck wagon, hay racks, and even logs cut from the cottonwoods themselves, he constructed a rough windbreak that formed a 3-sided shelter. It wasn't elegant, and it certainly wasn't built to last, but it created a pocket of relatively calm air in the midst of the howling storm. The work was exhausting beyond description. Imagine trying to handle timber and rope when your hands are so cold you can't feel what you're gripping, when every breath of air burns your lungs, when the wind is strong enough to knock you down if you're not careful. Morrison and his men worked in shifts, with some building while others warmed themselves at small fires, rotating constantly to prevent anyone from becoming so cold they couldn't function. But here's what made this strategy both brilliant and heartbreaking. Even when it worked it could only save a fraction of the animals. The makeshift shelter might protect 50 head of cattle, but what about the other 250 that couldn't fit inside? Morrison was forced to choose which animals deserved the chance to live, and which would be abandoned to face the storm alone. The criteria for these choices revealed how completely the winter had changed the moral landscape of the plains. The strongest animals, those most likely to survive on their own, were left outside. The weakest, those that would certainly die without shelter, were also left outside because saving them would consume resources needed for animals that still had a fighting chance. Only those in the narrow middle ground, weak enough to need help but strong enough that help might actually matter, were brought into the shelter. Watching Morrison make these decisions, his men later said, was like watching a man age years in a matter of days. Each choice carved new lines in his face. Each abandoned animal took something from him that couldn't be replaced. But he made the choices anyway because the alternative was losing everything to a misguided attempt to save everything. Other ranchers tried different approaches with varying degrees of success and failure. Some attempted to drive their herds south, hoping to find milder conditions and better grazing. These drives became epic journeys of endurance that tested both human and animal limits. Picture a trail drive in reverse. Instead of strong, healthy cattle being moved to market, these were desperate migrations of weakened animals being pushed toward increasingly uncertain destinations. The cattle, already on the edge of starvation, had to be driven through snow that sometimes reached their bellies, across frozen streams where the ice might hold their weight or might collapse and trap them in water that would kill them in minutes. Cowboys on these drives learned to recognize the signs of an animal that was about to give up entirely. The way their heads would start to hang lower, the increasing reluctance to move forward, the gradual slowing of their gait that meant their bodies were beginning to shut down. When a cow reached this point, there was usually no saving it. The kindest thing was often to put it out of its misery rather than let it die slowly while holding up the rest of the herd. Some of these southward drives covered hundreds of miles over terrain that would challenge experienced Arctic travelers. Men slept in the open with temperatures 30 below zero, sharing blankets with their horses when possible, burning anything they could find for fuel. They ate snow for water and subsisted on whatever frozen provisions they could carry, often going days without hot food. The psychological pressure of these drives was immense. Every mile south represented hope, the possibility of finding grass, milder weather, salvation for at least some of the herd. But every mile also meant leaving familiar territory for unknown country where conditions might be even worse. Trail bosses found themselves making navigation decisions based on guesswork and prayer, following creek beds that might lead to shelter or might lead to box canyons where the entire herd could become trapped. Some drives succeeded, reaching areas where the snow was lighter and some grass could still be found. Others ended in disaster when blizzards caught the herds in open country with no shelter at all. A few simply vanished entirely, hundreds of cattle and the men driving them disappearing into the white expanse, their fate unknown until the spring thaw revealed the scattered bones of their final encampment. Meanwhile, families who had decided to stay put developed their own desperate innovations. Some began burning anything that would produce heat, furniture, books, even structural timbers from their own homes. They were literally consuming their shelters to stay warm, gambling that they could make it through the winter before the house became uninhabitable. Others tried to create additional heat sources by building small fires inside metal buckets or pots, using these portable heaters to warm specific areas of their homes for brief periods. The risk of carbon monoxide poisoning or accidental fires was enormous, but the alternative was freezing to death, and that seemed like a more immediate threat than the possibility of future disaster. Mary Kellerman, trapped with her 2 young sons in a sod house that had begun to crumble from the repeated freezing and thawing, discovered that cow chips, dried buffalo or cattle manure, could be mixed with twisted grass and compressed into fuel blocks that burned longer than wood. The work of gathering and preparing this fuel was exhausting, requiring her to venture outside in deadly conditions to search for materials that could keep her family alive one more day. But perhaps the most innovative survival strategy was cooperation. Families who had maintained polite but distant relationships during prosperous times now found themselves sharing resources and labor in ways that would have seemed unthinkable before the winter. The Hendersons and the Johnsons, neighbors whose properties were separated by 3 miles of open prairie, began a system of alternating visits that ensured neither family was completely isolated. Every few days, weather permitting, one family would make the dangerous journey to check on the other, bringing news, sharing supplies, and most importantly, providing the human contact that was becoming as essential as food or fuel. These visits required careful planning and considerable courage. The journey that had once been a pleasant afternoon ride was now a life-threatening expedition. Travelers had to time their trips to take advantage of brief lulls in the weather, navigate by landmark and instinct through transformed terrain, and carry emergency supplies in case they became lost or trapped by sudden storms. But the psychological value of these connections was immeasurable. Knowing that other families were surviving, that the struggle was shared rather than solitary, provided a kind of fuel that couldn't be measured in calories or BTUs. The conversations that took place during these visits, sharing information about survival techniques, discussing the condition of livestock, simply talking about anything other than immediate survival, became lifelines to a world beyond the winter. Some communities organized informal rescue missions when families stopped appearing at designated meeting places. These expeditions, usually mounted by men whose own families were already on the edge of survival, represented a kind of heroism that received no recognition in the newspapers or dime novels, but embodied the deepest values of frontier life. Picture a rescue party setting out to check on a family that hadn't been seen for 2 weeks. 3 men on horses barely strong enough to carry them, following a trail that existed more in memory than in visible landmarks, knowing that they might be riding toward people who were already dead, knowing that the journey itself might kill them all. When they found families alive but trapped, the rescuers faced impossible decisions about resource allocation. Should they share their own meager supplies, potentially dooming their own families to save neighbors who might not survive anyway? Should they try to evacuate people to other locations that might not be any safer? Should they simply provide enough help to last a few more days and hope that would be sufficient? These decisions required a kind of moral calculus that no one had ever expected to need. The winter had stripped away the luxury of being able to help everyone who needed help, forcing people to make choices based on cold arithmetic rather than warm hearts. But here's what made these rescue efforts remarkable. They continued throughout the winter, even as the rescuers themselves grew weaker and their own families faced increasing danger. The commitment to community survival, to the idea that people were responsible for each other even in impossible circumstances, proved stronger than the purely rational calculation that suggested everyone should focus solely on their own survival. Some of the innovations that emerged during this period seem almost absurd in retrospect, but represented genuine attempts to solve impossible problems with inadequate resources. Families tried heating stones in their fires and then wrapping them in blankets to create portable heat sources. They experimented with reflecting heat from mirrors or pieces of metal. They built small windmills to generate heat through friction, most of which failed immediately but showed the kind of creative thinking that desperation could inspire. Others focused on food preservation and preparation techniques that could stretch their remaining supplies. They learned to make soup from bones they had already boiled multiple times, extracting nutrition that would have been discarded in better times. They discovered that certain tree bark could be ground into flour substitute, that animal hides could be boiled into a nutritious if unpalatable broth, that even sawdust could be mixed with small amounts of flour to create a filling if not particularly nourishing bread. But every innovation came with costs and risks. Eating bark or hide could provide calories, but also cause digestive problems that further weakened already struggling bodies. Experimental heat sources could provide temporary warmth, but also create fire hazards that could destroy what little shelter remained. The line between desperate innovation and fatal mistake was often invisible until it was too late. As the winter wore on and spring seemed more like a myth than a future reality, the most successful strategies were often the simplest ones: sharing what little you had, checking on your neighbors when possible, maintaining the small rituals that distinguished living from merely surviving, and refusing to surrender hope even when hope required more faith than evidence seemed to justify. These weren't the dramatic heroics of Hollywood westerns, but they were heroics nonetheless. The quiet, grinding heroism of people who chose to remain human, even when humanity seemed like a luxury they could no longer afford. The first hint that the winter might finally be loosening its grip came not as a dramatic moment of warmth, but as a subtle change in the quality of silence. Instead of the absolute deadening quiet of deep cold, there were small sounds, the occasional drip of water from an icicle, the distant crack of ice shifting on a frozen stream, the soft thud of snow sliding from an overburdened roof. These sounds, barely audible above the wind that still howled across the plains, carried more significance than the most joyous celebration. They meant the temperature had risen above the point where everything simply froze solid and stayed that way. They meant that somewhere, in ways almost too small to measure, the long retreat from winter had begun. But here's what made the coming of spring during the big die-up different from every other seasonal change in the history of the northern plains. No one was sure they wanted to see what would be revealed when the snow finally melted away. For months, the white blanket had hidden the true scope of the disaster. Cowboys had ridden past drifts without knowing that beneath the seemingly innocent mounds of snow lay the bodies of cattle that had huddled together for warmth before freezing in place. Families had looked out across pristine white landscapes without seeing the evidence of the catastrophe that had unfolded around them. The first thaw began in late March, almost reluctantly, as if winter itself was hesitant to reveal what it had accomplished. The snow didn't melt uniformly. Instead, it retreated in patches, exposing random squares of brown earth, like a jigsaw puzzle of revelation. James McKinnon, riding out to check on what remained of his herd after being trapped near his ranch house for 2 weeks, described the scene in his journal. The snow has pulled back from a hillside about 2 miles south of the house, and what I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my days. Cattle lying in neat rows, as if they had lined up to die. Some were still standing, frozen in the posture of life, but obviously dead, for weeks. The coyotes haven't even been able to get to them. They've been preserved like meat in an ice house. But this was just the beginning. As the days grew longer and the sun found strength it hadn't possessed for months, the pace of revelation accelerated. What emerged from beneath the snow wasn't the familiar landscape of the northern plains, but something that resembled a battlefield after a war between armies too large to comprehend. The mathematics of loss began to reveal themselves in ways that challenged the imagination. Jake Morrison, whose desperate fortress building had saved perhaps 50 head of cattle, discovered that his remaining herd of 1,500 animals had been reduced to fewer than 100 survivors. Charles Henderson lost 90% of his 2,000 head. The wealthy Scottish syndicate that had invested millions in Montana ranching saw herds that had numbered in the tens of thousands reduced to scattered hundreds. But the numbers, staggering as they were, couldn't capture the visual impact of the disaster. Picture riding across rangeland that had once supported dense herds of healthy cattle, now scattered with carcasses as far as the eye could see. The bodies weren't randomly distributed. They told stories about the final hours of the herds, revealing the desperate attempts animals had made to find shelter, water, or simply the comfort of being together when the end came. Some cattle had died along fence lines, pressed against barriers that had seemed like protection, but became traps when snow drifted against them. Others were found in creek bottoms where they had sought water, and instead found death as the streams froze solid around them. Many had simply collapsed in place, too weak to take another step, and been buried by subsequent snowfalls. The smell, when the wind was wrong, carried for miles. It wasn't just the odor of decay, though that was certainly present. It was something more complex, the concentrated essence of an entire ecosystem that had collapsed, mixed with the sweet, sick scent of carrion and the musty smell of wet earth that hadn't seen sunlight for months. Cowboys, who had spent the winter in desperate efforts to save their herds, now faced the grim task of surveying what remained. This work required a different kind of courage than the dramatic rescues they had attempted during the storms. It required the strength to confront failure on a scale that dwarfed individual human experience, to witness the complete collapse of a way of life they had believed was permanent. Riding through these fields of carcasses, many cowboys found themselves weeping, not just from grief for the animals they had failed to save, but from a deeper understanding of their own powerlessness against forces they had never imagined could exist. The mythology of the West had taught them that human will and hard work could overcome any obstacle, but the winter had revealed the limits of that belief in ways that shattered more than just economic dreams. The surviving cattle presented their own heartbreaking challenges. Many were so weakened by their ordeal that they could barely walk. Their ribs showed starkly through their winter coats, and their eyes held a haunted quality that seemed to mirror the expressions of the people trying to care for them. Some had suffered frostbite that left them with damaged hooves or missing pieces of their ears and tails. Others had developed infections or diseases that would claim them in the coming weeks, despite their survival of the winter itself. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the behavioral changes in the surviving animals. Cattle that had once grazed peacefully in scattered groups now huddled together obsessively, as if afraid that separation meant death. They had become nervous, skittish, quick to panic at sounds or movements that would never have bothered them before the winter. The trauma had changed them in fundamental ways, creating a herd mentality based on fear, rather than the natural social instincts that had governed their behavior for thousands of years. The human survivors faced their own version of this psychological aftermath. Men who had prided themselves on their strength and competence found themselves unable to make simple decisions, overwhelmed by choices that would have been routine before the winter. Women who had held their families together through impossible circumstances now struggled with depression and anxiety as the immediate crisis passed, and they had time to fully comprehend what they had endured. Children showed perhaps the most complex reactions to the end of winter. Some became clingy and fearful, reluctant to leave their parents' sight or to venture outside even when the weather was mild. Others seemed to have aged beyond their years, displaying a kind of caution and seriousness that belonged to much older people. Many had trouble believing that spring was real, that the winter was truly over, that they could trust the world to remain warm and safe. The economic devastation was so complete that it challenged the basic assumptions upon which the entire cattle industry had been built. Ranchers who had been millionaires on paper in the fall of 1886 were now bankrupt, their entire wealth reduced to scattered bones on the prairie. Eastern investors who had funded the expansion of Western ranching saw their investments wiped out so completely that many never attempted to recoup their losses. But the disaster extended beyond individual financial ruin to systemic collapse. The assumption that cattle could survive winters on the open range without supplemental feeding had been proven catastrophically wrong. The belief that the northern plains could support unlimited numbers of livestock had been shattered. The entire economic model that had driven the expansion of ranching across the West had been revealed as fatally flawed. Banks that had financed ranch operations found themselves holding mortgages on properties that no longer had the livestock to make payments possible. Towns that had grown up to serve the ranching industry saw their populations begin to dwindle as cowboys lost their jobs and ranchers abandoned their spreads. The ripple effects of the disaster spread far beyond the immediate area, reaching into the financial centers of the East and even across the Atlantic to the European investors who had bankrolled so much of the expansion. Yet even in the face of such comprehensive disaster, some found reasons for cautious optimism. The grass, once the snow melted completely, proved to be in surprisingly good condition. The severe grazing pressure of previous years had been eliminated by the death of so many cattle, and the heavy snow cover had actually protected the root systems of prairie plants. For the first time in years, there would be abundant grass for whatever livestock survived. This realization led to the beginning of a different approach to ranching in the northern plains. Those ranchers who had managed to save even small portions of their herds began to talk about smaller operations, winter feeding programs, and hay production. The era of simply turning vast herds loose, on unlimited range, was ending, but perhaps something more sustainable could take its place. The survivors also discovered strengths and skills they hadn't known they possessed. Families who had been forced to become completely self-sufficient during the winter found that they could continue many of these practices during normal times, reducing their dependence on expensive supplies shipped from distant cities. Communities that had been forced to cooperate for survival maintained some of their collaborative relationships, creating support networks that proved valuable during future challenges. But perhaps the most profound change was in the relationship between the human inhabitants of the northern plains and the environment itself. The winter had stripped away the illusion that nature was a benevolent force that would provide for human needs as long as people worked hard enough. It had revealed the plains as a place of enormous beauty and equally enormous danger, where survival depended not on conquest, but on adaptation. As spring progressed and the immediate crisis passed, people began to process what they had experienced in more reflective ways. Some found that their faith had been strengthened by their survival, interpreting their endurance as evidence of divine protection. Others lost their religious beliefs entirely, unable to reconcile their suffering with the idea of a loving God. Many discovered that their priorities had been permanently altered. Concerns that had seemed important before the winter, social status, fashion, minor business disputes, now appeared trivial in light of what they had survived. The experience of facing death on a daily basis for months at a time had given them a different perspective on what truly mattered in life. The spring of 1887 was not the joyous celebration of survival that might have been expected. Instead, it was a time of quiet assessment, of trying to understand what had happened and what it meant for the future. The big die-up had ended, but its consequences would shape the American West for generations to come. The great cattle herds that had once darkened the prairies were gone forever. The open range that had seemed as permanent as the grass itself had been closed not by barbed wire, but by the brutal mathematics of survival. An era had ended not with the bang of gunfights or the drama of gold rushes, but with the quiet collapse of dreams frozen beneath the snow. Yet life, as it always does, began to reassert itself. The survivors had learned lessons that no textbook could teach, gained strength that no ordinary hardship could provide, and discovered depths of endurance they had never known they possessed. They had been tested by circumstances that would have destroyed weaker people. And they had not merely survived, they had found ways to remain human in the process. The story of what they had accomplished would be told and retold, though often in versions that missed the quiet heroism of their daily endurance. But the real legacy of the big die-up wasn't in the stories that would be told about it. It was in the changed lives of the people who had lived through it, and in the harder wisdom they carried with them into whatever challenges the future might bring. As we drift back toward our own time, leaving behind the frozen world of 1886 and 1887, it's worth pausing to consider what the big die-up teaches us about the nature of survival, the power of human endurance, and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are when everything familiar falls away. The winter that nearly ended. The cattle kingdom wasn't just a weather event. It was a revelation. It stripped away every comfortable assumption the people of the northern plains had made about their relationship with the natural world, about the sustainability of their way of life, about their own strength and resilience. And in doing so, it revealed truths that Hollywood westerns would spend the next century trying to obscure. The heroes of this story weren't the quick-draw gunfighters or larger-than-life outlaws of popular mythology. They were ordinary people, cowboys who had never expected to be tested beyond their limits, farm wives who discovered reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed, children who learned to find hope in circumstances that offered little reason for optimism. Their heroism wasn't demonstrated in dramatic confrontations or spectacular rescues. It was embodied in the daily choice to get up and try again when trying seemed pointless, to share resources when selfishness would have been understandable, to maintain hope when despair was the logical response, to remain human when humanity itself seemed like a luxury they could no longer afford. Sarah McKinnon, the widow we met struggling to heat her cabin while rationing food for her children, survived the winter. Her youngest son would grow up to become a teacher, carrying with him his mother's quiet strength and her understanding that survival sometimes requires a hardness that breaks your heart. Her middle child became a doctor, driven by memories of helplessness in the face of suffering that could not be treated. Her eldest became a rancher, but a different kind of rancher, one who cut hay before every winter, who maintained emergency food supplies, who understood that the land could withdraw its gifts as suddenly as it provided them. Jake Morrison, who built the desperate cattle fortress that saved 50 animals while 1,500 died around them, never fully recovered from the guilt of those choices. But he spent the rest of his life developing new methods of winter feeding and animal shelter that would prevent future disasters. His innovations, born from the terrible knowledge of what could happen when preparation met reality, saved thousands of lives in subsequent harsh winters. The children who survived the Big Die-Up grew up to build a different kind of West. They were more cautious, more prepared, more aware of their own vulnerability. But they were also more compassionate, having learned that survival was not an individual achievement, but a collective effort that required people to care for each other even when resources were scarce. They became the generation that fenced the range, not out of greed or spite, but out of hard-earned wisdom about the limits of open grazing. They were the ones who established the cooperative programs that helped farmers and ranchers weather future disasters. They built the schools and hospitals and community organizations that provided the social safety net the frontier had previously lacked. In many ways, the Big Die-Up marks the end of the mythological Wild West and the beginning of the modern American West. It was the moment when the fantasy of unlimited expansion met the reality of environmental constraints, when the dream of individual conquest encountered the necessity of community cooperation, when the romance of frontier life confronted the mathematics of survival. The lessons it taught were not the ones people wanted to learn. They preferred stories of heroic individuals triumphing through superior courage and determination. But the winter of 1886-87 had different lessons to offer. That human beings are more fragile than they like to believe. That nature is more powerful than human ambition. That survival often depends more on cooperation than competition, and that the difference between civilization and chaos can be as thin as the margin between enough resources and not quite enough. Yet, there was also something profoundly hopeful in what these people accomplished. They faced circumstances that would have broken many of us today, and they found ways not just to survive, but to maintain their humanity in the process. They discovered that people can endure more than they ever imagined possible when endurance is the only alternative to surrender. They learned that love and care for others can motivate extraordinary efforts, even when self-interest would counsel giving up. They found that hope can persist, even when reason suggests it should have died, and that the human spirit has resources that can't be measured in calories or BTUs or any other material currency. The Big Die-Up also reminds us that the stories we tell about our past shape our understanding of our present. The mythological version of the West, all gunfights and gold rushes and dramatic showdowns, has dominated American imagination for so long that we've almost forgotten the quieter truths it obscures. The real West was a place where survival often looked like a woman carefully rationing the last of the flour while maintaining hope that spring would come. It looked like neighbors helping each other even when they barely had enough for themselves. It looked like men making impossible choices about which animals to save and living with the guilt of those decisions for the rest of their lives. It looked like children learning to be adults before they had finished being children, and adults learning to be vulnerable in ways their culture had never taught them to accept. It looked like communities discovering that their strength lay not in their individual toughness, but in their willingness to depend on each other. These are not the stories that sell movie tickets or inspire theme park attractions, but they are the stories that explain how human societies actually function under pressure, how people actually behave when everything they thought they knew about the world proves to be wrong, how communities actually form and survive and adapt when survival is genuinely uncertain. The Big Die-Up happened more than 130 years ago, but its lessons remain relevant because the fundamental challenges it revealed haven't disappeared. We still live in a world where resources are limited, where environmental forces can overwhelm human planning, where individual survival depends on collective wisdom and cooperation. We still face the question of how to balance individual desires with community needs, how to prepare for disasters we hope will never come, how to maintain hope and humanity when circumstances seem designed to strip both away. We still struggle with the temptation to believe that technology and wealth can insulate us from the basic vulnerabilities that define the human condition. The people who lived through the Big Die-Up learned that security is always temporary, that comfort should never be taken for granted, that strength is measured not by what you can accomplish when everything is going well, but by what you can endure when everything falls apart. They learned that heroism is usually quiet and undramatic, that it looks like getting up and trying again when trying has failed repeatedly, that it consists of caring for others when you barely have the resources to care for yourself. Most importantly, they learned that survival is not the same thing as living, and that the goal isn't just to get through difficult times, but to get through them in ways that preserve what makes life worth living in the first place. As you settle into sleep tonight, carrying with you the story of that terrible winter and the remarkable people who survived it, remember that you carry within yourself the same potential for endurance, the same capacity for hope, the same ability to find strength in connection with others. The challenges you face may be different from those confronted by Sarah McKinnon or Jake Morrison, or the countless unnamed families who held each other close while the wind howled outside their inadequate shelters. But the resources they discovered within themselves, the ability to adapt, to persist, to care for others even at great personal cost, those resources are part of your inheritance as a human being. The stars that shine above your comfortable bed tonight are the same stars that provided the only light in those frozen ranch houses, the same stars that guided lost cowboys across transformed landscapes, the same stars that gave hope to people who had every reason to despair. They shine on, as they did through that winter of testing, as they will through whatever winters may come. They remind us that some things endure even when everything else changes, that beauty persists even in the midst of suffering, that light continues even when darkness seems absolute. The wind still whispers across the northern plains where millions of cattle once grazed, where desperate families once huddled around inadequate fires, where ordinary people discovered extraordinary reserves of strength. The grass grows green each spring over soil enriched by the bones of that great dying, and life reasserts itself as it always does, as it always has, as it always will. The Big Die-Up is over, but its echo continues in the wind, in the wisdom of those who learned to read the sky for signs of coming storms, in the communities that remember the importance of looking out for each other, in the quiet understanding that survival is not an individual achievement, but a shared responsibility. Sleep now, and let that understanding settle into your dreams. Let yourself be carried by the same wind that once carried the voices of people calling to each other across the snow, people who refused to give up, who chose to keep trying, who found ways to remain human when everything around them seemed designed to strip humanity away. In their story, you may find whatever strength you need for your own winters, whatever storms may come, because the greatest lesson of the Big Die-Up is the simplest one, that human beings, when tested by circumstances that seem impossible to survive, often discover that they are stronger, kinder, and more resilient than they ever dared to believe. And that discovery, once made, becomes a light that no winter can extinguish.